A clash of worlds. The late afternoon sun blazed down on a small park in the heart of the city. Children played on the swings, families gathered under picnic shelters, and local vendors lined the sidewalks selling everything from handmade crafts to homemade snacks. But at the center of the park stood a small stage where a community event was taking place. The crowd surrounding the stage had grown steadily throughout the day, drawn by the commanding presence of a man whose voice resonated with strength and experience. Isaiah Carter stood tall on the makeshift stage, his broad shoulders clad in a simple button-down shirt that bore the subtle sheen of his many medals of honor. A retired Marine in his 60s, Isaiah had become a cornerstone of the community. His words weren't just stories, they were lessons, battle-worn truths shared to inspire the young and the restless, to remind them of the power they held even in the face of injustice. "I've been told my whole life that I don't belong," Isaiah said, his voice calm but brimming with conviction. "That my worth depends on the color of my skin or the size of my paycheck. But let me tell you something, they don't get to decide that. We do. Every single one of us. We decide how far we'll go, how hard we'll fight, and how much we'll stand for each other." The crowd broke into applause, some clapping, others whistling, as Isaiah's words echoed through the park. Among the spectators were young men and women who looked up to him, drawn to his authenticity and unshakable spirit. Parents nodded, their faces reflecting gratitude for a man who had become a symbol of hope in a neighborhood often overlooked by the rest of the city. But not everyone in the crowd shared the same admiration. The officer in the shadows. At the edge of the park, leaning against the hood of his patrol car, Officer Jacob Riley watched the scene unfold with barely concealed disdain. Riley, a man in his mid-30s with a hard-edged demeanor, was a regular in the area, but not for the right reasons. Known for his short temper and abrasive attitude, he was the kind of officer who made his presence felt more through intimidation than protection. As Isaiah's speech continued, Riley's smirk widened. He tapped his baton against his thigh, the rhythmic sound betraying his impatience. "Courage," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. These people wouldn't know courage if it hit them in the face. He hadn't expected anyone to hear him, but his words carried further than intended. A young boy nearby glanced up at him, wide-eyed, before quickly retreating to his mother's side. Riley's eyes narrowed. He wasn't here to blend in, he was here to remind everyone who was in charge. The interruption. As the applause from the crowd began to die down, Riley's voice suddenly cut through the air like a knife. "Courage? Please," he scoffed, loudly enough to ensure everyone heard. "The only thing you've ever fought for is a handout." The crowd froze. The joyous atmosphere of the event evaporated in an instant, replaced by a tense, electric silence. All eyes turned toward Riley, whose smirk deepened as he began walking toward the stage. Isaiah's brow furrowed, but he didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Excuse me," he asked, his tone calm but firm. "You heard me," Riley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know why these people think you're some kind of hero. You're just another loudmouth trying to make excuses for people who can't follow the law." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of disbelief and anger. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the interaction, while others whispered among themselves. A few began stepping closer to the stage, as if ready to shield Isaiah from the officer's words. Isaiah took a deep breath, his expression unflinching. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice unwavering. "I faced enemies on foreign soil who had more respect for me than you're showing right now." Riley scoffed. "And I'm supposed to care? You want respect? Try earning it like the rest of us." The tipping point. The crowd grew restless, their anger simmering just below the surface. A young man near the front, his fists clenched, took a step forward. "Hey, back off," he shouted, his voice echoing through the park. But Isaiah raised a hand, stopping him. "No," he said, his eyes locked on Riley. Let him say what he wants to say. He wants to humiliate me. Let's hear it. Riley's smirk twisted into something darker. He began circling the stage like a predator, his baton tapping against his hand. "Oh, I've got plenty to say," he sneered. "You stand here preaching about courage and justice, but what do you really know? You think a couple of medals make you better than me? News flash, they don't. You're just another nobody trying to act important." The words hit like daggers, but Isaiah didn't flinch. He stood tall, his silence more powerful than any retort. The crowd, however, grew more agitated. Some began shouting at Riley, demanding he back down, while others pulled out their phones, capturing every second of the escalating confrontation. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, Riley raised his hand, not in a gesture of restraint, but in a full swing. It wasn't a shove or a slap, it was a punch, thrown with the kind of force meant to silence, intimidate, and humiliate. The crowd gasped, some frozen in shock, others rushing forward. But before the punch could land, Isaiah moved. Reflexes honed by experience. With the precision of a trained Marine, Isaiah blocked the punch in one fluid motion and countered with just enough force to deflect Riley's balance. The officer staggered back, clutching his wrist, his face a mixture of shock and rage. "You shouldn't have done that," Riley hissed, his voice low and menacing. Isaiah's gaze was steady, his voice calm but steely. "No, you shouldn't have done this." The crowd erupted. Cheers and shouts filled the air as people rallied around Isaiah. Phones captured every moment, and within minutes, the videos began spreading online. Riley, humiliated and furious, stormed off toward his patrol car, his radio crackling with demands for his location. Isaiah stood on the stage, breathing heavily but maintaining his composure. The crowd surged toward him, some patting him on the back, others offering words of support. But Isaiah's mind was already elsewhere. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. What had started as a community event had become a flashpoint for something much larger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Isaiah knew that the fallout from this moment would ripple far beyond the park. What happened next would shock not only the crowd, but the entire city. The aftermath. The sun dipped low behind the city skyline, casting the park in hues of orange and purple as Isaiah Carter stood amidst a sea of murmurs and cell phone screens. The crowd's energy crackled with disbelief, anger, and admiration. Moments ago, a police officer had swung at the retired Marine in an unprovoked act of aggression. Isaiah had blocked the punch with the grace of a trained soldier, turning a moment of humiliation into a demonstration of dignity and strength. But the encounter was far from over. The crowd speaks out. "Are you okay, Mr. Carter?" a young woman asked, stepping forward with concern etched on her face. She was one of the many who had captured the altercation on her phone, her hands trembling as she held the device. "I'm fine," Isaiah replied, his voice steady but firm. "Thank you for your concern." Others began to speak up, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage. "That officer was way out of line. Why do they always think they can treat us like this? He should be fired on the spot." Isaiah raised his hand to quiet the crowd. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaos around him. "Thank you," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I appreciate your support, but let's not let anger take control. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and unfortunately, it might not be the last. But if we let ourselves stoop to their level, we lose the battle." The crowd nodded, though the tension lingered. Isaiah could see the frustration in their eyes, a reflection of years, generations, of being treated as less than. He knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about every person in the crowd who had ever faced prejudice and been silenced. A viral moment. While Isaiah addressed the crowd, the videos of the incident had already begun spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags like #JusticeForIsaiah and #OfficerRiley were trending on social media platforms. The footage painted a stark picture, a decorated black veteran being disrespected and attacked by a uniformed officer. The captions accompanying the videos varied, but the sentiment was universal. This man fought for our country, and this is how he's treated. Isaiah Carter stood his ground with dignity. We stand with him. How much longer will this be allowed to happen? Isaiah's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but he ignored it. He wasn't one for social media or public attention. His focus was on the people around him, the ones who had witnessed the incident firsthand and needed guidance. The officers retreat. Meanwhile, Officer Jacob Riley sat fuming in his patrol car a few blocks away. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind replaying the confrontation over and over. How had it gone so wrong? He'd intended to assert control, to show the crowd who was in charge. Instead, he'd been humiliated, his authority undermined in front of dozens of onlookers. His radio crackled. Officer Riley, report your location. We're receiving multiple complaints from the event at Carter Park. Over. Riley hesitated before responding. 10-4, on my way back to the precinct. He knew he was in trouble. The department wouldn't take kindly to a public spectacle like this, especially with the growing scrutiny on law enforcement's treatment of minorities. But instead of self-reflection, his thoughts were consumed with anger and resentment, toward Isaiah, toward the crowd, and even toward his own colleagues who might reprimand him. At the precinct. By the time Riley arrived at the precinct, his supervisor, Captain Sandra Monroe, was waiting for him. A tall, commanding woman in her early 50s, Monroe had a reputation for fairness but zero tolerance for misconduct. Her stern expression told Riley everything he needed to know. In my office. Now, she said curtly. Riley followed her, his jaw clenched. Once inside, Monroe closed the door and turned to face him, her arms crossed. What the hell happened, Riley? She demanded. I've got videos of you throwing punches at a civilian, no, not just a civilian, a decorated veteran, blowing up my phone and plastered all over social media. What were you thinking? He was disrespecting me, Riley snapped. I was trying to defuse the situation, but he kept provoking me. Monroe's eyes narrowed. Defuse the situation? Is that what you call throwing a punch in front of a crowd? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you escalated it. Riley opened his mouth to argue, but Monroe held up a hand. Save it. This isn't going away, Riley. Internal Affairs will be conducting a full investigation. Until then, you're suspended without pay. Suspended? Riley's voice rose. You're taking his side. I'm taking the side of accountability, Monroe shot back. You don't get to wear that badge and abuse your power. Now get out of my office. Isaiah's quiet strength. Back at the park, Isaiah finally began to make his way home. The crowd had dispersed, though many had stayed behind to clean up after the event. A few people walked alongside him, offering words of support and encouragement. Thank you, Isaiah said to each of them, his gratitude genuine. But as he turned the corner onto his quiet street, he sighed heavily. The day had taken more out of him than he'd let on. Inside his modest home, Isaiah sat down at the kitchen table, running a hand over his face. His medals hung on the wall behind him, a testament to his years of service. But tonight, they felt like a reminder of how little some people valued that service. The doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. When he opened the door, he found his neighbor, a young man named Marcus, standing there with a laptop in hand. Mr. Carter, you need to see this, Marcus said, stepping inside. They sat at the table as Marcus pulled up the videos from earlier. Isaiah watched in silence as the footage played, showing Riley's aggression in his own calm response. The views and comments were climbing by the second. You're a hero, Mr. Carter, Marcus said. People are standing with you. This could be the start of something big. Isaiah shook his head. I'm no hero, Marcus. I just did what I had to do. Exactly, Marcus replied. And that's what makes you a hero. The city takes notice. By the next morning, the incident was the top story on every local news channel. Journalists gathered at Carter Park, interviewing witnesses and replaying the viral videos. Civil rights organizations began to organize rallies in support of Isaiah, calling for accountability and justice. Isaiah, however, stayed out of the spotlight. He spent the day fielding calls from friends, family, and even former comrades who had seen the footage. Each conversation left him more resolved to use this moment for good. This isn't about me, he told one caller. It's about the message. People need to see that dignity and strength can prevail, even in the face of injustice. A meeting is called. That evening, Isaiah received an unexpected call from Captain Monroe. She wanted to meet with him to discuss the incident and hear his perspective directly. Isaiah agreed, knowing this was an opportunity to ensure that what had happened wouldn't be swept under the rug. As he prepared for the meeting, he glanced at his medals once more. They weren't just symbols of his past, they were a reminder of his duty to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The meeting. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Isaiah Carter's modest kitchen as he sipped his coffee, preparing himself mentally for the day ahead. Captain Sandra Monroe, the precinct's commander, had reached out the previous evening, requesting a private meeting to discuss the now viral incident between Isaiah and Officer Jacob Riley. Isaiah had agreed, not because he sought an apology or closure for himself, but because he saw this as an opportunity to push for real change, not just for his neighborhood, but for countless others facing similar struggles. As he buttoned his shirt, his hands paused for a moment. The weight of the medals hanging on the wall behind him seemed heavier than usual. He wasn't just a retired Marine anymore, he had become the voice of a movement, one that he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The walk to the station. Isaiah chose to walk to the precinct. It wasn't far, and the fresh air gave him time to gather his thoughts. As he moved through the neighborhood, people waved at him from their porches, their expressions filled with a mix of pride and concern. "We're with you, Mr. Carter," a young woman called out from her front steps. "Thank you," Isaiah replied, nodding politely. Children played on the sidewalks, their laughter a reminder of what he was ultimately fighting for, a future where they wouldn't have to grow up feeling devalued or afraid because of their skin color. Isaiah's steps felt lighter as he approached the precinct, buoyed by the support of his community. The precinct. The precinct loomed large, a stark gray building with reflective windows that seemed to watch Isaiah as he approached. A few officers stood outside, their eyes narrowing as they recognized him. Isaiah wasn't sure whether their looks were out of respect, curiosity, or resentment. Either way, he held his head high as he entered. Captain Monroe was waiting for him in the lobby, her posture straight and professional. She extended her hand. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming," she said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Thank you for inviting me," Isaiah replied, shaking her hand firmly. Monroe gestured toward a private conference room down the hall. "Let's talk in here. I want to make sure we have privacy." Isaiah followed her, noticing the glances from other officers as they passed. Some were subtle, others overt, but none deterred him. The conversation begins. The conference room was simple, just a long table, a few chairs, and a window overlooking the street below. Monroe motioned for Isaiah to sit, then closed the door behind them. She took a seat across from him, placing a file folder on the table. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I want to start by apologizing for what happened to you. Officer Riley's behavior was unacceptable, and I want you to know that we are taking this matter very seriously." Isaiah studied her carefully. Her tone was measured, but he could sense the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. "I appreciate that, Captain Monroe," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about me. What happened that day is part of a larger problem, and it's not going to go away with a simple apology." Monroe nodded. I understand, and I agree. That's why I wanted to speak with you directly. The video of the incident has sparked a lot of attention, both from the public and from within the department. There's an internal investigation underway, and Officer Riley has been suspended pending the outcome. Isaiah leaned forward slightly. And what happens after that? Will he face real consequences, or will this be swept under the rug like so many other cases? Monroe met his gaze, her expression serious. I can't promise you the outcome, but I can promise you transparency. I've already called in internal affairs, and they'll be conducting a thorough review. But I also want to go beyond just this one incident. We need to address the underlying issues that allowed this to happen in the first place. Isaiah nodded, appreciating her honesty. Then let's talk about solutions. Because this can't keep happening, not to me, not to anyone. Proposals for change. For the next hour, Isaiah and Monroe discussed potential reforms. Isaiah spoke from experience, drawing on both his military background and his years of living in the community. He emphasized the importance of better training for officers, not just in de-escalation tactics but in understanding the communities they served. We need officers who see us as people, Isaiah said. Not as threats. Not as stereotypes. That starts with education, cultural competency, implicit bias training, and regular community engagement. Monroe listened intently, taking notes. I agree, she said. And I think we can start by bringing in community leaders, people like you, to participate in training sessions. Officers need to hear these stories firsthand. Isaiah smiled faintly. I'll do whatever I can to help. But it has to be more than just talk. There needs to be accountability. Officers who cross the line need to face real consequences. They will, Monroe assured him. That's a promise. The officer's reckoning. While Isaiah and Monroe worked toward solutions, Officer Riley faced a much different reality. Word of his actions had spread quickly, not just online but within the precinct. Many of his colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his behavior. Others openly criticized him, calling him a liability. Riley sat in his apartment, scrolling through the comments on the viral video. The anger and condemnation were overwhelming. People were calling for his termination, some even threatening to protest outside the precinct. His once unshakable confidence had been replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. For the first time, he began to question his actions. He had always believed he was upholding the law, but now he couldn't ignore the possibility that his biases had clouded his judgment. The community rally. Back in the neighborhood, plans for a community rally were underway. Marcus, the young man who had shown Isaiah the viral video, took the lead in organizing the event. Flyers were distributed, and word spread quickly. The rally was set to take place at the same park where the incident had occurred, with Isaiah as the keynote speaker. On the day of the rally, hundreds of people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Respect our veterans." Local news crews set up cameras, eager to capture the event. When Isaiah took the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. He waited for the noise to die down before speaking. Thank you all for being here, he began. This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about all of us, about every person who has ever been judged, dismissed, or mistreated because of the way they look. It's about demanding accountability, but it's also about building bridges. We need to hold people accountable for their actions, yes, but we also need to create opportunities for understanding and growth. His words resonated deeply, drawing cheers and nods of agreement. Isaiah's message was clear: change was possible, but it required effort from everyone. A glimmer of hope. As the rally continued, Captain Monroe arrived, standing quietly at the back of the crowd. She watched as Isaiah spoke, her respect for him growing with every word. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. Isaiah's leadership had sparked something powerful, something that couldn't be ignored. The city was watching, and the pressure for change was mounting. The investigation and the unraveling truth. The rally had brought a wave of attention, not just to Isaiah Carter's story but to the deeper issues of systemic prejudice that plagued the community. As the days passed, the pressure on the precinct mounted. Internal Affairs had launched a formal investigation into Officer Jacob Riley's actions, and public scrutiny only intensified as local and national media picked up the story. For Isaiah, the rally wasn't the end of his involvement, it was only the beginning. He knew that real change wouldn't come from speeches or viral videos alone. It required persistent action, strategic planning, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. He was ready. The Internal Affairs Inquiry. At the precinct, the Internal Affairs officers conducted interviews with everyone involved in the incident. Witnesses from the crowd provided statements, describing how Officer Riley had antagonized Isaiah without provocation. The video footage became the centerpiece of the investigation, leaving little room for Riley to deny his actions. Sitting in the sterile, windowless interview room, Riley shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the lead investigator, Agent Miller, flipped through a thick file of documents. "Officer Riley," Miller began, his tone professional but sharp, "we have reviewed the footage and collected multiple witness accounts. All of them corroborate that you escalated the situation with Mr. Carter unnecessarily. Do you have any explanation for your behavior?" Riley hesitated, his usual bravado faltering under the weight of evidence. "Look, he was being disrespectful, challenging my authority in front of a crowd. I was trying to maintain order." Miller raised an eyebrow. "By throwing a punch at an unarmed, retired Marine? A man who, by all accounts, was speaking peacefully and posed no threat." Riley's jaw tightened. "He provoked me." Miller leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "The only provocation here seems to be your inability to handle a situation with professionalism. This isn't just about one incident, Officer Riley. We've reviewed your record, and there are multiple complaints of excessive force and inappropriate conduct. Care to explain those?" Riley's face reddened, but he remained silent. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. Isaiah's plan for reform. While the investigation continued, Isaiah met with community leaders, activists, and local officials to develop a concrete plan for reform. They drafted proposals for mandatory de-escalation training, cultural competency workshops, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board to review complaints against officers. One evening, Isaiah hosted a meeting at the community center. Around a long table sat a diverse group of individuals, young activists, retired professionals, pastors, and even a few off-duty officers who supported the cause. "We need to strike while the iron is hot," Isaiah said, his voice steady but urgent. "The attention this incident has brought gives us leverage. We have to demand change, not just for ourselves but for the next generation." A young woman named Tanya, a law student and one of the rally organizers, nodded. "Agreed. But we need to ensure these proposals are actionable and backed by data. If we come across as unorganized, they'll dismiss us." Isaiah smiled. "That's why you're here, Tanya. Your expertise will keep us on track." The group worked late into the night, drafting their plan and preparing to present it to city officials. Isaiah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable, it was about transforming a system. Riley's world crumbles. As the investigation deepened, Riley found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues avoided him, and his suspension left him with too much time to dwell on his actions. For the first time, he began to confront the biases that had shaped his behavior. Late one night, he sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through the comments on the viral video. The criticism was brutal, but one comment stood out: "This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that allows people like him to think this is acceptable." Riley stared at the words, a knot tightening in his chest. He thought back to his training, his upbringing, and the moments in his career when he'd let his biases guide his decisions. He hated to admit it, but the comment was right. He wasn't just a product of his own choices, he was a product of a flawed system. A city on edge. As news of the investigation spread, tensions in the city grew. Protests erupted outside the precinct, with demonstrators demanding justice for Isaiah and accountability for Riley. Signs reading, "Respect our veterans," and "Justice for Isaiah," filled the streets. The protests were peaceful, but the message was loud and clear: the community wouldn't back down. Inside the precinct, Captain Monroe faced mounting pressure. She knew that the outcome of the investigation would set a precedent, not just for her department but for the city as a whole. She also knew that appeasing the public without addressing the root causes of the problem would only lead to more incidents like this. The confrontation. One afternoon, as Isaiah was leaving the community center, he was approached by a young reporter. "Mr. Carter," she said, holding out a microphone, "how do you feel about the investigation into Officer Riley?" Isaiah paused, choosing his words carefully. "I believe in accountability," he said. "Not just for Officer Riley, but for the system that allowed this to happen. Change doesn't come from pointing fingers, it comes from taking responsibility and working together to build something better." The reporter pressed on. "Do you think the officer should be fired?" Isaiah's expression hardened slightly. "That's not my decision to make. But I do think there should be consequences for actions like his. Without accountability, there's no trust. And without trust, there's no progress." His words went viral, further fueling the national conversation around police reform and racial bias. An unexpected visitor. A week later, as Isaiah was sitting on his porch, a car pulled up to the curb. To his surprise, Riley stepped out, looking hesitant and unsure of himself. Isaiah watched him approach, his face unreadable. "Mr. Carter," Riley began, his voice subdued. I wanted to talk to you." Isaiah gestured for him to sit on the porch steps. "I'm listening." Riley took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day. About what I did. About why I did it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for how I treated you, but for the attitude I've had for most of my career." Isaiah studied him for a long moment before responding. "Acknowledging the problem is a start," he said. "But words mean nothing without action. What are you going to do to change?" Riley nodded, his gaze earnest. "I don't know yet. But I want to learn. I want to be better. And I'm willing to listen." Isaiah's expression softened slightly. "Then you've got work to do." "With all due respect, Mr. Carter," Monroe replied, "you've already made a difference. The community trusts you, and your insight could help us bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people we serve. Please consider it." After a long pause, Isaiah nodded. "All right, Captain. Let's give it a shot." The Reform Board. The first meeting of the advisory board was held in a conference room at the precinct. The board included community leaders, activists, and officers who were committed to change. Isaiah was one of the oldest members, but his presence commanded respect. The discussions were intense, often heated. Isaiah pushed back against policies that perpetuated bias and championed ideas that prioritized de-escalation and community engagement. Over time, the board began to draft a series of recommendations, including mandatory cultural competency training, transparent disciplinary procedures, and the establishment of a civilian oversight committee. For Isaiah, the work was exhausting but fulfilling. He saw the seeds of change taking root, even if progress was slow. Riley's attempt at redemption. Meanwhile, Riley began attending counseling sessions and workshops on racial bias and cultural awareness. It was a humbling experience, one that forced him to confront the prejudices he had carried for years. He reached out to community organizations, volunteering his time to better understand the people he had once dismissed. One day, Riley mustered the courage to write a letter to Isaiah. It wasn't an attempt to absolve himself but a genuine expression of remorse. Dear Mr. Carter. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that our encounter changed me. I've been working to understand the harm I caused and to become a better person. Thank you for showing me dignity when I didn't deserve it. You've inspired me to do better, and I promise I won't stop trying. Sincerely, Jacob Riley. A new chapter. As the months passed, the reforms Isaiah and the advisory board proposed began to take effect. The precinct implemented new training programs, and officers were required to engage with the community regularly. The Civilian Oversight Committee was established, giving residents a platform to voice their concerns. At the next community rally, Isaiah stood on the same stage where the initial confrontation had occurred. The crowd had grown even larger, with people from across the city coming to support the movement. We've made progress, Isaiah said, his voice strong. But this is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without all of us working together. Let's keep fighting, not with anger, but with determination and hope. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a testament to the power of unity. A legacy of change. The months following the rally marked a profound shift, not just for Isaiah Carter's neighborhood but for the entire city. What had begun as a confrontation between a decorated black veteran and a prejudiced police officer had grown into a movement, a rallying cry for justice, accountability, and unity. For Isaiah, the journey was far from over. Though progress had been made, he knew that the fight for lasting change required vigilance, resilience, and the collective efforts of the community. And now, as the first major reforms began to take hold, he found himself reflecting on the impact of their hard-fought victories and the challenges still ahead. A new era in law enforcement. At the precinct, the reforms spearheaded by Isaiah and the advisory board were beginning to take effect. Officers were required to attend monthly training sessions on cultural competency, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques. These workshops were led by a diverse team of educators, psychologists, and community leaders, including Isaiah himself. In one such session, Isaiah stood at the front of a classroom filled with uniformed officers. The room was silent as he shared his story, his voice steady but filled with emotion. When I served as a Marine, I fought alongside men and women from every background, different races, religions, and walks of life. We didn't see each other as threats or enemies. We saw each other as people. That's what I want you to see when you walk into our neighborhoods. Not suspects. Not stereotypes. People. One officer raised his hand. Mr. Carter, how do we rebuild trust when so much damage has already been done? Isaiah paused, his gaze thoughtful. It starts with humility. A willingness to admit when you're wrong and to listen, really listen, to the people you serve. Trust isn't given freely, it's earned. And earning it takes time and consistent effort. But it's worth it. The officer nodded, and Isaiah saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Riley's redemption. Meanwhile, Jacob Riley was undergoing his own transformation. Stripped of his badge and burdened by the weight of his actions, he had chosen to face his mistakes head-on. His volunteer work with community organizations had opened his eyes to the struggles and injustices faced by those he once dismissed. He began mentoring at-risk youth, sharing his own story as a cautionary tale. One day, Riley attended a town hall meeting hosted by Isaiah. Though he kept to the back of the room, his presence didn't go unnoticed. When the meeting ended, Riley approached Isaiah, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Carter, he began, his voice quiet but earnest. I wanted to thank you. For calling me out. For making me see what I refused to see before. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm trying to do better. Isaiah studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he extended his hand. It's not about me forgiving you, Riley. It's about you proving to yourself and to others that you've changed. Keep doing the work. Riley shook his hand, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. I will. The community thrives. In Isaiah's neighborhood, the impact of the reforms was already being felt. Relationships between residents and officers began to improve as community policing initiatives were implemented. Officers attended local events, listened to residents' concerns, and worked collaboratively to address issues. One such event was the annual Community Day, held in Carter Park. Families gathered for food, music, and games, the air filled with laughter and joy. Isaiah stood near the stage, watching as children played and neighbors chatted. For the first time in years, the park felt like a place of unity and hope. Tanya, the young law student who had helped draft the reform proposals, approached Isaiah with a broad smile. "Mr. Carter, look at this. This is what change looks like." Isaiah nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "It's a start, Tanya. But we still have a long way to go." A national spotlight. Isaiah's story continued to gain national attention. He was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and even Capitol Hill, sharing his journey in advocating for systemic change. His calm yet commanding presence made him a powerful voice in the fight for justice. At one event, a young woman approached him, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I saw the video of what happened to you, and it gave me the courage to stand up for myself. Thank you for showing us what strength and dignity look like." Isaiah placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle. "The strength was always in you. Sometimes it just takes a spark to ignite it." Building a legacy. As Isaiah's influence grew, he remained deeply rooted in his community. He established a non-profit organization dedicated to bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. The organization provided resources for education, advocacy, and support, ensuring that the momentum for change would continue long after the headlines faded. Isaiah's home became a hub of activity, with volunteers, activists, and neighbors stopping by to share ideas and plans. Despite the demands on his time, Isaiah always made room for these conversations. He knew that change wasn't a solo effort, it was a collective one. A reflection on service. One evening, Isaiah sat on his porch, a warm cup of tea in hand. The photograph of his squad mates rested on the table beside him. He thought about the battles he had fought, both overseas and at home, and the sacrifices he had made along the way. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Isaiah felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced adversity with courage and turned pain into purpose. And though the fight for justice was far from over, he knew that the seeds of change had been planted. In the distance, he heard the laughter of children playing in the park, a reminder of the future he was working to build. A future where dignity and respect weren't just ideals, but realities. Epilogue, a lasting impact. Years later, Isaiah's name became synonymous with resilience and justice. The reforms he championed were adopted not just in his city, but in communities across the country. His nonprofit grew into a national organization, empowering countless individuals to advocate for change. At a dedication ceremony, Carter Park was officially renamed Isaiah Carter Community Park. As Isaiah stood before the crowd, now older but still strong, he smiled. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady. "It's about all of us. About what we can accomplish when we stand together. The fight isn't over, but we've shown what's possible. And that's a legacy we can all be proud of." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Isaiah looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, diverse and united, and felt a profound sense of fulfillment.